Hey class, in this video lecture we will discuss indirect bad news messages. We'll start out by looking at indirect bad news structure, and we'll then consider an example of an indirect bad news message. So let's start out by talking about how you can effectively structure your indirect bad news message. But first, let's review the circumstances under which you would select a direct or indirect approach to conveying bad news. You want to select a direct approach if the bad news is urgent, if the bad news is not so bad, if the bad news is expected, or if you're writing up, for instance, to a supervisor or a manager. You want to take an indirect approach, on the other hand, if the bad news is not urgent, if the bad news is hard to take, if the bad news is unexpected, or if you're writing downward within a company or institution's hierarchy, or if you're writing outside of your company or institution. But while we have previously discussed the circumstances under which you'd choose a direct versus indirect approach to conveying bad news, we haven't yet discussed the benefits of the indirect approach. The main benefit of the indirect structure is that it's essential for explaining your point of view to your audience and for keeping your audience reading, ideally through as much of your message as possible. Now, whenever I'm talking about the indirect approach to conveying bad news, at some point, I usually get some variation on this question. But won't I sound like a snake if I take an indirect approach to conveying bad news? Won't I sound like a weasel? Won't I sound shady? Won't I sound like I'm not trustworthy? And the unfortunate answer to all of those questions is yes. Yes, you will sound a little snake-like, but it's still worth it to take an indirect approach to conveying bad news. And to understand why, think about a bad news message that you may have received in the past and ask yourself if you actually continued reading that message after you encountered the bad news. And if you're anything like me, the answer to that question is no. When I get a bad news message, once I arrive at the bad news, if it's a paper message, that message is torn up. It is torn up, it is destroyed, it is in the trash can within mere moments. And that's totally understandable. That's totally normal. So if you actually want your reader to engage with your rationale for arriving at the bad news, if you want them to understand why you made the choice that you did, you've got to take an indirect approach. This is the only way to keep your audience reading through as much of that message as possible. And keeping them reading is critical because oftentimes explaining yourself, explaining why you arrived at a given position or outcome is the only thing that will make your reader feel better about the bad news. And as a result, the only thing that will help salvage your relationship with your reader. So even though you will appear somewhat snake-like if you take that indirect approach to conveying bad news, it is ultimately helpful for both your reader, yourself, and your relationship. So keep all of that in mind if you ever have those feelings of misgiving while writing an indirect bad news message. But how do you do it? How do you actually structure it? Well, first, you want to open your indirect bad news message by establishing what we call neutral context. And we'll describe the characteristics of neutral context at greater length momentarily. You then want to sandwich your bad news in the middle of an RBR paragraph. We call this paragraph the RBR paragraph because it begins with rationale, our first R. It then proceeds to the bad news, and it concludes with forward-looking resolution, right? Opens with rationale R, bad news B, resolution R. Then finally, you close that message with goodwill. So that's how you do it. That's the basic structure of an indirect bad news message. But to make this more concrete, let's now look at an example of an indirect bad news message. We're going to start, as we discussed earlier, with the neutral buffer. And the neutral buffer should do three main things. First, it should establish a neutral tone for your message. It should establish context for the bad news. And most critically, it should not give away the bad news. If your neutral buffer, that opening paragraph or section of your bad news message, if it gives away the bad news, it's no longer neutral, okay? And it's no longer a buffer. So here's an example of a neutral buffer, in this case, just a single paragraph that does all three of these things. Colleagues, after Starbucks loosened its dress code in September, many of you emailed asking if Uncommon Grounds planned to do the same. You made a strong case that a looser dress code would make your working lives easier and inject more personality into our workplace. Again, establishes a neutral tone for this message, it establishes context, and it doesn't give away the bad news. We don't know what the bad news in this message is yet. We then move on to the RBR paragraph or section. We want to lead with our rationale, explain why we arrived at the bad news. We then want to drop the bad news and state it only once. And finally, we want to conclude this paragraph with forward-looking resolution. Now, as a word to the wise, you should never put your bad news at either the beginning or the end of your RBR paragraph. If you put the bad news at the beginning or the end of that RBR paragraph, it's going to be very easy for your reader to find. And what happens when our reader can very easily and quickly find the bad news? That's right, they stop reading. So all of that work that you've put into your indirect message is gone straight out the window, okay? So remember, never put your bad news at the very beginning or very end of your RBR paragraph. So here's an example of an RBR paragraph. Since September, I've carefully considered your request. As I've done so, I've reflected on what draws customers to our store. In both Yelp reviews and in-store comments, customers repeatedly praise two of our store's qualities: our high-quality coffee and our store's elegant, old-fashioned atmosphere. This atmosphere, I believe, is informed by the way we dress. I worry that if we were to abandon our shirt and tie dress code, we would lose some of the shop's characteristic elegance. But while Uncommon Grounds will maintain its current dress code, I nevertheless thank you for your input. In fact, I want to encourage you to provide further input by giving employees who submit formal proposals on improving working conditions a $100 Amazon gift card. So in this paragraph, we spend the bulk of our time providing a rationale for the bad news. That's the content in red. We then state the bad news once. That's the content in green, where we say, guess what, y'all? We are not changing the dress code. And then we pivot to resolution. This is the content in blue, where we're trying to provide some alternative to the bad news, or reassure our audience that even though they're not getting exactly what they want, that we can provide some sort of compromise measure or something comparable to their desired outcome. And then finally, we want to move on to the Goodwill Closing. In the Goodwill Closing, you should avoid restating the bad news. That's critical. One and done is the rule with conveying bad news, and you want to conclude on a positive note. The Goodwill Closing is a lot like the resolution. In fact, they're basically the same. But the reason why we have effectively two parts of the message that do more or less the same thing is because, as we discussed previously, bad news messages, they threaten your relationship with your reader. And so you want to spend a ton of time and a ton of energy shoring up your relationship with your reader. And you do that through goodwill, right? Goodwill is all about building relationships. And so effectively, we're building two opportunities to establish goodwill with our readers into our indirect bad news messages. So now let's look at an example of a goodwill closing. Thank you all for your thoughtful suggestions and for everything you do to make Uncommon Grounds Tampa Bay's leading upscale coffee shop. I'm honored to work with you all, right? So we're not repeating the bad news and we're closing this message on a positive note. We're providing more goodwill in addition to that goodwill that we included in the resolution, the end of our RBR paragraph, and we're helping to firm up our relationship with our readers. Now, just as a friendly reminder, if your message is an email, you want to use your subject line to establish context. You don't want to give away the bad news in the subject line. We discussed that in another video lecture, but it's sufficiently important that it's worth coming back to here. All right, so just as a quick reminder, you should take an indirect approach to conveying bad news if the bad news is not urgent, if the bad news is hard to take, if the bad news is unexpected, or if you're writing down within your organizational hierarchy or outside your company or institution. You want to open your indirect bad news message by establishing neutral context. You then want to sandwich your bad news in the middle of an RBR or rationale bad news resolution paragraph. And finally, you want to close your message with goodwill. And that's how you do it. That's how you structure an indirect bad news message. Thanks for watching, everybody.